The desert heat shimmered off the tarmac as Staff Sergeant Maria Santos stepped from the transport truck, her small frame dwarfed by the towering soldiers around her. At 5 feet 2 inches, she barely reached most of their shoulders, her compact build making her appear almost fragile among the hardened warriors of Fort Braxton. The military-issued uniform hung loosely on her petite frame, and her dark hair was pulled back in a regulation bun that made her look younger than her 28 years. Colonel Bradley Mitchell watched from his office window as the new arrivals processed through the gate. His eyes settled on Maria with immediate dismissal, a slight shake of his head betraying his thoughts. "She looks like she belongs in a typing pool, not a combat unit," he muttered to his aide. The colonel stood 6 feet 4 inches tall, his broad shoulders filling out his uniform with the kind of presence that commanded attention and demanded respect. Maria felt the weight of curious stares as she made her way to the administration building. Whispers followed in her wake, soldiers wondering what desk job had brought such a small woman to their elite base. She kept her eyes forward, her expression calm and professional, giving no indication that she heard their murmured comments or noticed their skeptical glances. "Where in the world are you watching this story unfold, and what time is it where you are right now?" Maria's journey is just beginning, and warriors like her exist in every corner of our global community. The following morning brought Maria's first direct encounter with Colonel Mitchell during the weekly briefing. She entered the conference room quietly, taking a seat near the back as other officers filled the space with their commanding presence. The colonel's voice boomed across the room as he outlined training schedules and deployment preparations, his authoritative tone leaving no room for questions or debate. When the briefing concluded, Colonel Mitchell's gaze swept the room and landed on Maria. "Sergeant Santos," he called out, his voice carrying a condescending edge that made several officers turn to look. "You'll be handling administrative duties until we figure out where someone of your capabilities might actually be useful." The emphasis on capabilities drew quiet snickers from a few of the men, though others remained respectfully silent. Maria stood at attention, her posture perfect despite the obvious slight. "Yes, sir," she replied, her voice steady and professional. She had heard variations of this conversation countless times before, in different uniforms and different rooms, but the melody remained the same. Small women were secretaries, not soldiers, in the minds of men like Colonel Mitchell. As she gathered her materials and prepared to leave, Maria caught the eye of Captain Reynolds, a fellow officer who had been watching the exchange with obvious discomfort. His slight nod of acknowledgement told her that not everyone at Fort Braxton shared the colonel's antiquated views. Perhaps there were allies to be found among the skeptics, soldiers who judged ability over appearance and measured worth through actions rather than assumptions. The administrative office became Maria's prison over the following weeks, a cramped space filled with filing cabinets and outdated computer equipment that hummed constantly in the desert heat. Colonel Mitchell seemed to take particular pleasure in assigning her the most menial tasks possible, from organizing decades-old personnel files to typing reports that other soldiers had scrawled in barely legible handwriting. Each morning brought new indignities disguised as assignments. "Clean out the supply closet, Santos," the colonel would bark when he passed her desk. "Make sure those uniforms are properly folded this time." His voice carried across the office space, ensuring that everyone within earshot understood exactly where Maria ranked in his estimation of military hierarchy. The other soldiers began to treat her accordingly, some with pity and others with the casual dismissal reserved for those deemed unimportant. Lieutenant Chen would drop stacks of paperwork on her desk without acknowledgement, while Sergeant Murphy made jokes about having a personal secretary that drew uncomfortable laughter from the younger recruits. But Maria endured it all with the same calm professionalism that had carried her through years of similar treatment. She completed each task with meticulous attention to detail, her efficiency gradually earning grudging respect from those who worked closely with her. When a particularly heavy box of files needed moving, she lifted it without complaint, her movements fluid and controlled in ways that might have seemed unusual to anyone paying close attention to such things. The harassment intensified as Colonel Mitchell grew bolder in his treatment of Maria, his comments becoming increasingly personal and inappropriate. During morning formations, he would single her out for uniform inspections that lasted far longer than necessary, his critical eye searching for any minor infraction that might justify further humiliation. "Your boots could use more polish, Santos," he would announce loudly, though her footwear gleamed like mirrors in the desert sun. The breaking point came during a supply inventory when Colonel Mitchell cornered Maria in the storage room, his massive frame blocking the only exit. "You know, Santos," he said, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper, "I'm starting to wonder if you're really cut out for military life at all. Maybe you'd be happier back home, cooking meals and raising babies like nature intended." Maria's hand stilled on the clipboard she was holding, her knuckles widening almost imperceptibly as she fought to maintain control. Her breathing remained steady, but something shifted in her posture, a subtle straightening that made her seem somehow more substantial despite her small stature. "Sir, with respect, my assignment here is legitimate and my service record speaks for itself," she replied, her voice carrying a new edge that Colonel Mitchell was too arrogant to recognize as a warning. The colonel stepped closer, invading her personal space with deliberate intimidation. "We'll see about that, Santos," he sneered, finally turning and leaving her alone among the shadows and stacked supplies. The morning formation buzzed with nervous energy as Colonel Mitchell strode onto the parade ground, his expression darker than usual. The entire battalion stood at attention in perfect rows, but his eyes immediately found Maria among the ranks. "Santos, front and center," he barked, his voice carrying across the desert air like a whip crack. Maria stepped forward with measured precision, her small frame dwarfed by the sea of larger soldiers surrounding her. The colonel began circling her like a predator, his voice rising so every soldier could hear his words. "This is what passes for a warrior in today's military," he announced, gesturing dismissively at Maria's compact build. "Tell me, Santos, what exactly do you think you could contribute in actual combat?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Maria felt hundreds of eyes boring into her from every direction. "Sir, I am trained and qualified in multiple combat disciplines," she replied, her voice steady despite the public humiliation. Her answer drew snorts of disbelief from some of the watching soldiers, though others maintained respectful silence. Colonel Mitchell's laughter boomed across the formation. "Combat disciplines," he repeated mockingly. "The only thing you're disciplined in is looking like you belong in a high school classroom instead of a military base. Have you ever faced real danger, Santos, or just paperwork emergencies?" The insult stung, but Maria's expression remained impassive as she processed the colonel's words. Around her, she could sense the mixture of sympathy and second-hand embarrassment radiating from her fellow soldiers, some of whom were beginning to recognize the cruel unfairness of this public spectacle. The colonel's public humiliation continued as he paced around Maria, his boots grinding against the sandy ground with each deliberate step. "Maybe we should test your combat readiness right here, Santos," he suggested, his tone dripping with malicious amusement. "Show us all these mysterious combat disciplines you claim to possess." A murmur rippled through the formation as soldiers exchanged uncertain glances. This was crossing lines that even the most hardened veterans recognized as inappropriate, but Colonel Mitchell's rank made him untouchable in their military hierarchy. Captain Reynolds shifted uncomfortably in his position, his jaw clenched as he watched the spectacle unfold. Maria remained perfectly still, her breathing controlled and steady despite the mounting pressure. "Sir, I would prefer to demonstrate my capabilities through proper training channels rather than during formation," she replied, her voice carrying a note of restraint that suggested depths beneath the surface. The colonel stopped directly in front of her, his towering frame casting a shadow across her small form. "What's wrong, Santos?" he taunted, stepping closer until he violated every regulation regarding personal space and appropriate conduct. "Afraid to show everyone what you're really made of?" The tension in the air became palpable as the entire battalion held its collective breath. Some soldiers had begun to recognize that they were witnessing something that would be remembered long after this formation ended, though none could predict exactly how these moments would unfold. Have you ever seen someone underestimated because of their appearance, only to surprise everyone around them? Sometimes the biggest revelations come in the smallest packages. Colonel Mitchell's patience with Maria's restraint was rapidly evaporating, his face reddening as she continued to maintain her professional composure despite his escalating provocations. "You think you're better than the rest of US, don't you, Santos?" he snarled, moving even closer until his chest nearly touched her shoulder. "All that quiet superiority, like you're holding back some great secret." The watching soldiers could feel the dangerous shift in the colonel's demeanor, his usual calculated intimidation giving way to something more volatile and unpredictable. Even the most loyal among his supporters began to sense that their commanding officer was approaching a line that should not be crossed, regardless of rank or protocol. Maria's eyes remained fixed straight ahead, but her stance had subtly shifted into something that martial artists would recognize as a ready position, balanced and grounded despite appearing casual to untrained observers. "Sir, I respectfully request permission to return to formation," she said, her voice carrying a new undertone that suggested this would be her final attempt at de-escalation. The colonel's hand moved toward her shoulder in what appeared to be an aggressive gesture, but Maria's peripheral vision caught the movement with the hyper-awareness of someone trained to recognize threats. Her muscles tensed imperceptibly, years of conditioning preparing her body for action even as her mind hoped desperately that such action would not become necessary. What would you do if you found yourself in Maria's position, facing down someone who refused to respect your boundaries or acknowledge your worth? Sometimes standing up requires more courage than backing down. The colonel's hand made contact with Maria's shoulder, not quite a push but far more than appropriate, his fingers gripping her uniform with enough force to wrinkle the fabric. The gesture crossed every line of military protocol and professional conduct, transforming what had been verbal harassment into something that demanded immediate response. Maria turned slowly to face him directly, her movement controlled and deliberate. "Sir, I need you to remove your hand," she said, her voice dropping to a tone that carried unmistakable authority despite her junior rank. The change in her demeanor was subtle but profound, like watching a sleeping tiger open its eyes. Colonel Mitchell's grip tightened instead of releasing, his face twisted with the arrogance of someone who had never faced real consequences for his actions. "You don't give me orders, Santos," he growled, using his size advantage to loom over her even more aggressively. "I think it's time someone taught you about respect and your place in this man's army." The watching battalion had gone completely silent, every soldier sensing that they were witnessing a moment that would define careers and possibly end them. Captain Reynolds took a half-step forward, his instincts screaming that intervention was necessary, but military protocol and chain of command held him frozen in place. Maria's breathing remained perfectly steady, but her eyes had taken on a different quality, the calm before a storm that experienced fighters would recognize immediately. "Colonel, this is your final warning," she said quietly, her words carrying across the silent formation like a promise rather than a threat. Colonel Mitchell's response to Maria's warning was a harsh laugh that echoed across the formation like a challenge thrown down before an entire army. "Final warning," he repeated mockingly, his grip on her shoulder becoming painful enough to leave marks. From a little girl playing soldier who probably can't even do 10 push-ups without crying. The insult was designed to break her composure completely, to reduce her to tears or rage that would justify whatever came next in the colonel's twisted logic. But Maria's reaction was neither tears nor fury. Instead, something shifted in her eyes, a transformation that veterans of real combat would recognize as the moment when a warrior stops pulling punches. Colonel Mitchell raised his free hand, whether to strike her or grab her other shoulder remained unclear, but the intent was unmistakably aggressive. The gesture was witnessed by 300 soldiers who would later testify to exactly what they saw, though many would struggle to believe their own memories of what happened next. Maria's voice cut through the desert air with crystalline clarity. "Colonel Mitchell, you are in violation of multiple military regulations and I am authorized to defend myself," she stated, her words carrying the weight of legal precedent and years of training that no one in the formation suspected she possessed. The watching soldiers leaned forward unconsciously, sensing that the moment of truth had finally arrived. Some would later describe feeling the air itself change, as if the desert wind had suddenly shifted direction and brought with it the promise of justice. Colonel Mitchell's hand descended toward Maria's face in what 300 witnesses would later describe as a clear attempt to strike a subordinate officer, his massive fist cutting through the desert air with the confidence of someone who had never faced real resistance. But the blow never landed. Maria's response was a blur of motion that seemed to defy the laws of physics, her small frame suddenly exploding into action with the precision of a Swiss timepiece and the devastating efficiency of a guided missile. Her left hand intercepted the colonel's descending arm while her right hand found his wrist, and in one fluid movement that lasted less than 2 seconds, she had twisted his entire body into a position that left him completely helpless. The sound of Colonel Mitchell's arm breaking was audible across the entire formation, a sharp crack that cut through the desert silence like a gunshot. His scream of pain and shock followed immediately after, a sound that none of the watching soldiers had ever heard from their supposedly invincible commanding officer. Maria held him there for exactly 3 seconds, his 6'4" frame bent at an impossible angle while his broken arm hung useless at his side. Then she released him with the same controlled precision she had used to subdue him, stepping back to a perfect position of attention as the colonel collapsed to his knees in the sand. The entire battalion stood frozen in stunned silence, their minds struggling to process what they had just witnessed. In less than 5 seconds, their understanding of Staff Sergeant Maria Santos had been completely and permanently shattered. The aftermath of Colonel Mitchell's defeat rippled through the formation like shockwaves from an explosion, soldiers turning to each other with expressions of disbelief and awe. Captain Reynolds was the first to break from the stunned silence, rushing forward to assess the situation while medics were called to tend to the colonel's obviously broken arm. Maria remained at perfect attention, her breathing completely normal despite having just executed one of the most technically demanding defensive maneuvers in military combat training. Her uniform was unwrinkled, her posture impeccable, and her expression showed no trace of satisfaction or regret, only professional composure. Colonel Mitchell writhed on the ground, his face pale with shock and pain as the reality of his situation became clear. The woman he had dismissed as a weak administrative clerk had just demonstrated combat skills that surpassed anything he had ever encountered in his 20-year military career. His broken arm would heal, but his reputation and authority were permanently shattered. General Harrison arrived within minutes, having been summoned by the urgent radio calls that followed the incident. His experienced eyes took in the scene immediately, the colonel on the ground with medics attending his injury, Maria standing calmly at attention, and 300 soldiers who looked like they had witnessed a miracle. "Santos, report," the general commanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had seen every possible scenario in his decades of service. Maria's response was crisp and professional. "Sir, I defended myself against an unprovoked physical assault using minimum necessary force as authorized under Military Regulation 2710. This is the moment when everything changes, when someone who has been underestimated finally gets the recognition they deserve. Share this with someone who needs to remember that strength comes in many forms." General Harrison's investigation revealed what the entire base would soon learn. Staff Sergeant Maria Santos held black belts in 4 different martial arts, was a certified Special Forces hand-to-hand combat instructor, and had served 2 tours in classified operations before her transfer to Fort Braxton. Her personnel file, which Colonel Mitchell had never bothered to read beyond her gender and size, contained commendations from 3 different generals and combat decorations that most soldiers could only dream of earning. The colonel's court-martial proceedings began within the week, his career ending in disgrace as witness after witness testified to his pattern of harassment and abuse. Maria's response to his assault was ruled completely justified, a textbook example of appropriate defensive action under extreme provocation. But the real transformation happened in the days that followed, as the story of the small woman who broke a colonel's arm spread throughout the military community like wildfire. Maria found herself treated with the respect and recognition that her skills and service record had always deserved, no longer judged by her appearance but by her proven capabilities. Captain Reynolds approached her after the morning briefing 3 weeks later, extending an invitation to join the base's elite training cadre as a combat instructor. The irony was not lost on either of them. The woman who had been assigned to filing duties was now being asked to train the base's most promising soldiers. Maria accepted the position with the same quiet professionalism that had carried her through years of underestimation and dismissal. Sometimes the greatest victories come not from seeking recognition, but from simply being ready when the moment demands you show the world who you really are.